Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel for another how-to video. This time we'll be building and painting the 1/43rd scale Land Rover Series 1 pickup starter set. This is another brand new starter set from Airfix, allowing us to build a replica of the humble Land Rover, which is one of the most instantly recognisable vehicles in automotive history, and as well as the kit in the box. Because it's a starter set, you get glue, a paintbrush and 4 acrylic paints to paint the kit, so everything you need in one box. On the back of the box you'll find the usual full colour actual size diagrams with callouts for the 4 acrylic paints supplied. These are detailed in the small clear boxes which point out on the diagram which colour needs to go where. In the small red boxes you'll find numbers corresponding to the supplied transfer sheet to assist with placing the markings. Inside the box you'll find 2 frames of grey injection moulded plastic containing all of the parts for the kit, and in a separate bag inside there's a clear frame which has all of the windows for the vehicle. In the smaller bag you'll find 4 acrylic paints and a small tube of Humbrol polycement to glue the kit together. There's a number 2 sized Humbrol Airfix paintbrush to do all of the painting, and a small transfer sheet has the number plates, the dials for the dashboard and the vehicle's badges. The instruction manual details the whole construction process, and it's worth giving this a good read before you start your build, as there are many areas, particularly on the interior, which won't be accessible later on in the project. There's also the Before You Start guide which details the common tools and techniques used in model building. We'll be covering most of them in this video, but most importantly step 1 is to wash all of the parts with soapy water, and we'll be doing that before we start the build in this video. With the frames washed and allowed to dry completely, we've put some cardboard down on the workbench to protect it, as we're going to give them a coat of Humbrol's acrylic primer spray. This will prepare the model surface for paint later on, but it is important to remember that if you're going to use this product, it is an aerosol, and it's important that you read the warnings on the can and the instructions on how to use it to make sure that you're working in a proper space and in the proper fashion. We've mounted the frames on some sticks just to allow us to turn them hands-free so we don't touch the primer when it's wet. And after giving the can a good shake and testing the spray pattern, it was time to apply a nice even coat of the spray primer all over the front face of each of the frames. Moving the can quickly side to side, making sure to cover all of the areas that are immediately accessible, we sprayed both frames before changing the angle on our spray to make sure that we got into all of the recessed areas and hit all of the other angles on the parts, giving them a good overall coat of primer, leaving no bare plastic visible. The end result is a nice, smooth, matte surface which will take the supplied acrylic paints much easier than painting onto bare plastic. With the primer completely dry, it's time to pick out the first parts we need to begin our build. The part numbers are referenced in the circular callouts in the instructions as a letter and a number. This is moulded into the small rectangular tab next to the parts themselves on the frame. Now that we've selected the right parts, we can trim away using the cutters any excess plastic and then cut the frame connection point a little way away from the surface of the parts to avoid any damage. This leaves a small protrusion which can be trimmed away with the modelling knife, and then we switch to the file to sand away any remaining signs of that connection point. Any excess plastic left behind can interfere with the fit of the parts, which is why we do extensive cleanup on each of the parts that we remove from the frame. The clear parts are cleaned up in exactly the same fashion, just with a little bit of extra care, as clear styrene is more brittle than the grey styrene. With all of the parts removed for step 1, we just need to do a bit of painting before we can start the assembly process. Using the paint number 196 supplied with the kit, we're going to open it and check to see whether there's been any separation while the kit's been in storage. If there has been separation, this can easily be reversed by giving the paint a good stir for about 30 seconds. After giving this paint a good mix up, the initial consistency is restored and we can transfer some of the 196 into the palette and then add a little bit of additional tap water. This extra water is added to a ratio of about 70% paint, 30% water, and the additional dilution just helps to slow the drying time of the paint, allowing it to self-level on the surface of the model. It does reduce the opacity of the paint somewhat, which means we'll need to add several layers to build up strong colour coverage, but the end result will be a much smoother and more even coat of paint than just applying one thick layer straight from the pot. While we've got this paint wet in the palette, we moved ahead and painted the rest of the interior components for the next stages of the build. We did this while the initial parts were drying, so we had plenty of time on our hands, and it just saves a bit of time as we move ahead with the project. Once the initial coat of paint has been allowed to dry fully, you can see that it's a little bit streaky, so we go ahead and apply an additional coat over the top. And you'll see straight away that the colour coverage starts to strengthen as we add that extra layer. Because the paint has been thinned, it won't obscure any of the details, so we can go ahead and add multiple coats to build up the strength of colour without obliterating any of the detail that's moulded into the parts. Next, we needed to paint the seats with number 96. This paint was prepared in exactly the same fashion, being added to the palette and then diluted with about 30% tap water, and then we started to pick out the seat cushions. Because this is a darker grey, it does cover far better than the light grey, so we'd only need a couple of coats to build up strong coverage. However, the two different colours do meet on the surface of these parts, so we took our time to very carefully build up a nice neat join between the two different painted areas. We also painted the seats on the lower portion of the interior that we'd need for stage 3. With our parts painted, it was time to use the polycement to begin the assembly process. Polycement works by melting the plastic together to form a permanent join, and it's supplied in a metal tube with quite a broad nozzle, which can make control of the glue difficult, especially for a beginner. To get better control over the glue, what we like to do is cut away a small piece of the kit box on the upper edge to form an applicator. We then cut one of the small tabs away from the box to form a pallet. We can now apply the glue to the pallet piece, and then switch to the applicator to transfer the glue from the pallet onto the model surface, giving us far greater control over where the glue goes. Because this model has a lot of windows, we're going to cut an even smaller applicator away, as this will allow for tiny amounts of glue to be added around the window openings, and this will help to prevent getting any of the glue on the clear parts. Before we apply any of the polycement, we're going to check the fit of the parts with a process known as dry fitting. The parts are pressed together without any glue, and the fit is checked to make sure that it's absolutely perfect. This will highlight if we've left any of the plastic from the frame connection points behind that's interfering with the way the parts go together. Once the dry fitting has been carried out successfully, we'll use one of the small applicators to add tiny dots of polycement around the inside of the rear window frame. We'll do this on both the recessed tabs at the side and around the top and bottom edges. Once the polycement's in place, we can carefully manoeuvre the rear windscreen into position and then push it down firmly into its final resting place. Because we used the small applicator, there's very little polycement on the edge of the model, so it won't bubble out onto the surface of the window. With the window in place, we can then paint in the support pillar down the middle with a little bit of the 196 paint supplied with the kit. Using the large applicator, we can then apply more polycement to the locating tabs for the main seat assembly, and then push this into position. With those three parts combined, stage 1 is complete and we can progress with the build. The main chassis of the Land Rover is all one piece, and this was snipped from the frame with the cutters before being cleaned up with the same process we showed earlier in the video. First, excess plastic was trimmed with a knife, before switching to the file to remove any trace of the connection points. Dry fit was then carried out with the rear wall of the interior assembled in stage 1, before we applied polycement in the areas marked yellow on the instructions, and then glued this part into place permanently. More polycement was then added into the locating recesses for the lower half of the interior, and then this part was guided into position until the locating tabs clicked into place. As we move on to the dashboard, we encounter the first of the transfers that are required, and these don't work like stickers and instead have to be cut free from the backing paper with the modelling knife before being immersed in tap water whilst held in the tweezers for just a few seconds. Once they've been soaked in water, these can be set aside for a minute to let the water free the transfer from the backing paper, and when it's ready to apply, it will move under gentle pressure from the paintbrush. A little touch of water is added to the surface to prepare it, and then the transfer is slid into position, and final movements can be made using the back of the modelling knife to get it into the perfect position. After adding all of the transfers required on the dashboard and allowing them to dry fully, we can move on to adding the windscreen. Again, we're using the small applicator to add dots of polycement around the inside perimeter of the frame, and then we can push the clear parts into position and then hold it for a few seconds while the glue takes hold. The steering wheel was given a couple of coats of number 33 matte black and then allowed to dry before being snipped away from the frame using the cutters. The connection point was cleaned away with the file, and this of course left a small area of bare plastic, and seeing as we already had the black paint in the palette, we simply touched this in and allowed it to dry. The front half of the Land Rover requires the addition of clear parts for the headlights, so we painted the inside of the apertures with number 196 to avoid any grey plastic being visible through the clear parts. Back of the headlights was then painted with number 11 silver to give the headlights that realistic metallic shine that you get on the real vehicle, before the polycement was added and the clear parts dropped into position. Once the front part of the vehicle was assembled, this then needed to be added onto the front end of the dashboard, so we applied polycement in all of the areas shown yellow on the instructions, before guiding the front of the vehicle into place and pushing it against the dashboard firmly until the polycement took hold. We left the steering wheel until last to avoid it getting knocked during assembly, but now that the front of the Land Rover is assembled, we glued the steering wheel into position and carefully checked its alignment to make sure it was on nice and straight. Once that was done, we simply glued the front of the Land Rover onto the chassis by applying polycement in the areas shown on the instructions and then pushing the assembly into position. The sides of the vehicle were snipped from the frame and cleaned up with the usual process before being dry fitted, allowing us to see which areas would be visible on the interior of the vehicle. These would need to be painted with number 196 before the parts were glued into position, so we diluted the paint with the usual 30% tap water and started to apply some nice thin layers of the paint to these areas. After allowing the initial coats of paint to dry, this was repeated until we had nice strong colour coverage. Using one of the small applicators to apply tiny dots of polycement around the window frames, we glued the side windows into position on both sides of the vehicle before switching to the larger applicator to apply the polycement for the main sides. When applying the glue for this join, we concentrated the cement along the inside faces of the parts so that any excess would squeeze out onto the inside of the model rather than out onto the visible face. This allowed us to add plenty of glue but keep the join nice and clean. With the polycement added, the sides were guided into position and just aligned carefully and then held for a few seconds while the glue did its work. The final part of the exterior that needs to be assembled is the tailgate. We added a sparing amount of glue to avoid any excess bubbling out and then pushed the part into place. We're left with something that's starting to look a lot like a Land Rover, and we can move on now to the most important part of the build, which is painting the body shell. Because the windows are fitted prior to painting on this model, we need to carefully edge all of the clear parts first before we block in the main body of colour. We worked our way carefully using the very tip of the brush to go right up to the edge of the windows with the number 196 paint diluted with the usual 30% tap water. If you do get any of the paint on the clear parts, you can simply allow it to dry and then scratch it away using a cocktail stick to neaten up the edges. With the windows fully edged, it was time to move into the middle of the panels and start blocking them in with the initial coat of paint. Because we've added extra tap water to our paint, the coverage isn't particularly strong and the dried finish is quite streaky, but this will solidify with further layers. With the top half of the vehicle completely dry, we moved on to the underside and painted all of the areas with number 196 that are shown in the instructions. After allowing the underside of the model to dry completely, we switched back to the top half and applied another layer of paint. Because of the additional tap water, We can apply multiple layers without obliterating any detail, and you won't get any of the three-dimensional brush strokes you often see in a model that's been painted with one thick layer of paint straight from the pot. We alternated between the top and bottom halves of the model, allowing the paint to dry fully in between coats, and we quickly had a nice solid coverage of the paint, and it had all gone down nice and smooth with no three-dimensional texture at all. The suspension components were cleaned up but left attached to the frame, supporting them while filing away the connection points to avoid snapping them off accidentally. These were then painted with 2 coats of number 96 paint from the kit, again diluted with the usual 30% tap water, and this colour is also called out on the suspension components moulded into the chassis, so these areas were painted at the same time. This process was given a bit of extra care and attention, as we didn't want to get any of the dark grey paint on the nice finish that we'd just achieved on the body shell. Because the parts which need to be painted in number 96 are separated from the light grey areas with moulded detail, we use these as a handy guide for the bristles of the brush. On the rear tailgate, which is a very visible area of the model, there's a moulded detail line between the 2 different coloured areas, and we located the bristles of the brush into this and used it as a guide to get a nice neat joint between the 2 different paints. When all of the paint was completely dry, we started snipping the suspension components from the frame, giving them a clean up and gluing them into place. Any bare plastic caused by the clean-up process was touched up before the parts were glued on. To avoid getting glue all over our finished model when gluing in the running gear, these parts were manoeuvred into position before the glue was added, and then they were lifted into their final resting place and held for a few seconds to make sure the glue had took hold. The wheels were given 2 coats of number 96, allowed to dry fully between layers, and then we prepared some number 33 matte black with the usual 30% tap water and started to paint in the tyres. There's a moulded lip between these 2 areas which we used as a handy guide for the bristles of the brush to get a nice neat join between the 2 different colours. Once the initial coat had dried fully, we repeated the process to solidify the colour coverage of the black paint. The wheels were then snipped from the frame and cleaned up in the usual fashion. Any excess plastic on the joining face between the 2 parts was carefully removed to ensure they fit together perfectly, and then polycement was added, concentrating towards the inside of the wheel so that any excess glue wouldn't bubble out and be visible on the finished model. The outside face of the wheels was then given an extra coat of matte black to cover up any visible grey areas, and then these were set aside to dry completely. A small amount of polycement was added to the end of each axle and the wheels pushed into position. We checked the alignment of each wheel as we added it and then moved on to the next one until all 4 wheels were added and we were ready to move on to the final touches on this project. Next step involves painting the trim around the windows and the rear of the pickup bed using number 11 silver. Having prepared the paint in the usual fashion with some additional tap water, the silver was painted onto all of the trim called out with number 11 in the instructions. It took a couple of coats to build up nice contrast between the silver and light grey, and these were allowed to dry fully in between applications. With all of the paint completely dry, it was time to add the markings. These were prepared in the same way we showed earlier in the video, being soaked in water to free them from the backing paper before being slid into position and then moved into their final resting place with the back of the modelling knife. Once all of the transfers were added, it was time for the cherry on the top, and we added the final piece, which is the spare wheel on the front of the model. And that completes the build of the Airfix Series 1 Land Rover pickup starter set. The humble Land Rover has more than earned its place in automotive history, being used in a wide variety of roles all across the world. By presenting this model in starter set format with its reduced parts count and improved build sequence, Airfix offer the opportunity to build a model of the legendary Land Rover for modelers of all ability ranges using only basic tools and the paints included with the kit. This is a model that's also not limited by the kit scheme, and you can really let your imagination run wild with colours and weathering on a model such as this. So we hope you've enjoyed watching us build the Land Rover Series 1 pickup today, and we hope you'll join us again for some more modelling in future. So as always, thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time.